Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon from wherever you are. I hope all is well. First off, happy Black History Month. And celebrating Black History Month, this is an episode, a part of the Black Excellence series on Voices for Excellence. And I am your host, Dr. Michael Connor, CEO and founder of the Agile Evolutionary Group. And I am happy to have, and yes, this is a subjective statement that I'm going to say, the best, right? The best superintendent in the United States. And the reason why I say that is because I love him, because we are both a part of the greatest fraternity in the world, Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, 1906. And to have, my brother, my colleague, my friend, a person I look up to personally, specifically when I was going through the trajectory of becoming a superintendent, this was the individual that I looked for strategies, for specific techniques. More importantly, how to be able to organize a coherent teaching and learning system that focuses on all. So I am fraternally happy to introduce Dr. Melvin Brown, the proud superintendent of Montgomery Public Schools in Montgomery, Alabama. Dr. Brown, how are you? Happy Black History Month. How's everything, my brother?
Well, thank you so much. Really honored and privileged to have an opportunity to have the conversation. Thrilled to be at the table and humbled by the whole experience. Thrilled to have January behind us.
We are in Neverwary, as I call it. It never ends, right? Oh man, now we're moving into February, but January, it just seemed like I was my birthday was on the 29th, right? And it felt like January 39th because it's just been ongoing long month. But as we continue to go on, that means that Dr. Brown, you're doing the real work, because if it feels like we're making slow, in the days and the evenings, that means that we're really thinking about how we can provide equitable learning environments for all. So it is just absolutely an honor to have you on the show. But before we start, Dr. Brown, a mutual friend that we have of ours, Dr. Tracy Davis, I took this from her, right? And I know last month you were a special guest at the IEI, I believe, Aspiring Superintendents cohort. And we know Dr. Tracy Davis, who is doing a great job in that development leadership role. But I got this question from her. And the question is, right, when you're with aspiring superintendents, right, or existing executive leaders that are bouncing off ideas to be able to enhance their teaching and learning organization, what's your equity song, right? When a song comes on, or a thought of a song for you as you enter a room, right? And I know it's going to be great because you're an alpha man. But what is that song that defines Melvin Brown? I mean, Dr. Brown, you are everywhere in the country. You're speaking everywhere. Leaders are coming to Montgomery, Alabama to see your work in place. But when they first engage with you in person, what is that equity song that describes you?
That's a great question. Obviously, in this space called equity, which is the work we should all be doing for all kids to get opportunity. We know the word's been hijacked a bit over the course of the last, 2-3 years. And it's become something that some folks in our communities don't necessarily accept or want to be part of. So what I typically try to do is turn the conversation around and make them tell me which kids they don't want me to educate and write their names down on a piece of paper. So I know, at least I know where they're coming from, which tends to shift the conversation. So as far as a song is concerned, I can come with one that's a little older and one that's a little bit newer, although for me, it's because I'm old, it's still old too. I could go back to The Revolution Will Not Be Televised by Jill Scott Heron, because much of the work that we're doing in the space of equity isn't about the plans you put out or the huge pronouncements you make. It's simply about doing the work and making sure all kids have those opportunities. And it doesn't have to become something where people can say, he's taken from this group to give to that group. That's not what equity is about. So if we're having real conversations, sometimes you have to just do the work under the radar to make it happen. So that work in itself isn't always going to be put on Front Street where everybody can look at the plan and pick it apart. And then at the same time, I think about the environment in which we work where we have so many different forces coming at us in so many different ways, much of it negative, much of it divisive, much of it untrue. I have to go back to my brothers from Public Enemy and harken back to Fight the Power. I'm also going to be unapologetic about how I handle those situations. When folks are in situations where they want to disparage the work or denigrate certain groups of students or say that we're taking from one group to give to another, I'm going to be very confrontational, if you will, and having to have that information put out there in real ways. I recall a conversation I had back in Ohio with a parent who asked me if we were doing that CRT stuff. And I said, well, before we get into this conversation, tell me what we're talking about. What is that? And the parent couldn't tell me. You get crickets. And I said, okay, great. Well, let's talk about the actual work we do.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of working for all kids, that is what we're supposed to do. That's why we're here. So if me giving kids an authentic view of what the world is and how they're supposed to approach it and how we make them able to survive it, then if that's what you want to call it, then sure, that's what it is. But we know that's not the definition. So let me give you the real definition.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it changed a lot of conversations in my previous district where we didn't have to confront some of the nonsense that was out there simply because we were honest about the approach.
Yeah. And when your two songs that you described, but the second one, Public Enemy of Fight the Power, when I think about Fight the Power, right, and it kind of creating this corollary relationship with the work, that goes hand in hand, right? Because the words, of Chuck D and Flavor Flav, man, wow, you're going back in the day with that. But it's interesting that you bring up CRT, right? Because there was a statement that was made last month when Governor DeSantis removed the advanced placement course for African American studies. And one of the resonating points that was highlighted was he said that there was undertones of CRT. And, I went back, me, a critical researcher, I went back and looked at that document. And what I read was individuals, or I should say a curriculum that highlights African Americans in a positive way that, conversations like that don't normally happen in school. So I don't know where this indoctrination is coming from with regards of an African American history course, which now falls under that label of critical race theory, right? When I think of CRT, I think of culturally responsive teaching, right? That's we should be.
Exactly.
The question should be now, what type of CRT practices, culturally responsive pedagogical practices are embedded in our classrooms to ensure that we're all. So hopefully, Dr. Brown, we can be able to start to change that narrative of CRT from critical race theory to culturally responsive teaching.
Yeah, I even addressed the term CRT or critical race theory in a way that's it's actually meant and given a real definition. We're simply talking about the historical intersection of race and the legal system and the implications for our country. It's as simple as that. But yet it's been hijacked and bastardized into something that it's not. And then we as K-12 folks have been accused of teaching curriculum based on that, which is the furthest thing from the truth. So my concern, my issue with those types of statements is that if you're going to have those conversations, be real, be truthful, and be authentic about them. Don't frame some conversation or some lie into something and make other people think it's real. One other thing he said was that that particular course had no educational value, which is incredibly insulting when you look at AP European history being accepted, or AP American history being accepted, or AP World history being accepted. It's extremely insulting. And thus the Chuck D in me comes out.
Absolutely. I mean, when you say African Americans don't bring any significance or contributions into the schools, that's just like saying African Americans within our schools don't bring any type of contributions, and that goes back to our kids that we focus in on that too. But let's just move on with that because we could spend the whole episode talking about that. But when we have to start moving away and continuing to educate people what critical race theory really is, because once we start politicizing, or we've already have, the nature and the beast of the education ecosystem, guess what? We're never going to reach that level of awe. So we got leaders like you to continue to push it, Dr. Brown. I'm telling you, we got a strong coalition to be able to move this. But my next question, right, and this is around your work. And I tell you, Dr. Brown, it's extraordinary, right? How you improved operational and instructional conditions in the various executive leadership roles and capabilities, or I'm sorry, capacities that you have. Presently, right now, you are the superintendent of Montgomery Public Schools, right? And if I'm an aspiring superintendent, or let's say I'm 3, 4, 10, 15, 20 years in as a superintendent, because again, if we adopt this continuous learning aspect of it, right, or this growth mindset that Carol DeWitt talks about, we're always growing no matter what year we are in our executive role. But in this time of the AC stage of education, right, the first typical year since 2018, 2019, how do we as a education entity in totality accelerate change, right? When various predictive models are suggesting catastrophic outcomes for Generation Alpha and Generation Z in education that make up 50% of the Black and Brown population in public education right now. So, what can we do to accelerate this change? I mean, we got, notions or variables of critical race theory that's holding us back, right, from really accelerating. But as leaders, you as a strategic leader, how do you accelerate that change?
Well, I think when we were impacted by COVID, we had an intersection of two different things that took place. Obviously, we were raised in the beginning of the accountability movement, where standardized tests became how you measured schools. And I think we were in a space as educators where we were constantly preparing kids to pass tests. We weren't necessarily teaching pedagogy. We weren't teaching in a way that learning would stick. We gave them opportunities to learn facts and then expected them to regurgitate those facts on a piece of paper. And then for many of our kids, that learning, quote unquote, went out the window because it didn't have an opportunity to be applied and didn't stick. Now we bring in COVID, which revealed so many stark disparities across all of our communities and made us pay attention to some things that I think inherently we knew, but they were easy to not pay attention to simply because they weren't quantifiable. Now we have data that shows all those disparities that have existed for so long, and we're playing catch up. So using the convergence of those two pieces and understanding that when we change what schools look like, how they operate, how they give kids senses of belonging and senses of connectedness, when adults truly forge partnerships and relationships with kids where they get to know the kids specifically and personally, and now kids come to school and they have that trusted adult that he or she can go to share any and everything under the sun when they're having one of those days. If we look at it from that standpoint, and we change educational models so that kids now can learn content and apply it in real life context, and understanding how they have an impact on the world, not just their classroom, I think that gives us an opportunity to change what education looks like. And at the same time, make kids better equipped to even pass those standardized tests that we still have around. If we are just simply having this notion that we're gonna improve our test scores, but we don't do anything to change that except teach more content more heavily and expect kids to gravitate toward it, we're going to make a heavy mistake that's going to impact the next generation of students. So we have an opportunity to really change things. Being here in Montgomery, this is only my 8th month here. It's been phenomenal to be able to watch how new and different conversations have brought about new and different practices. And it's rewarding to kind of see the beginnings of that, and how it's starting to bubble up through our district. I can't wait till we have this conversation 3 years from now, and we truly see the impact of what equity in education and opportunity for kids and changing classroom conditions and classroom cultures, how that impacts what academic performance looks like. The other big thing that was highlighted throughout COVID is the whole economic disparity in all our communities. Here in Montgomery, we're close to 100% free reduced lunch. Poverty is an issue by any means, and just like any other inner city. And how we address that has to look different than some suburbs, and that's okay. That's what our kids need. And knowing that that's the fact, we also then have to find ways to engage parents in conversations about school and about learning and about financial literacy and those types of things, so we can also work with them to help break cycles of generational poverty. My goal, my thrust, my passion, if you will, is to pursue breaking generational poverty as the product of generational poverty. It's my response. I feel it's my responsibility to help change that. I was fortunate in that my mom pushed me as much as she possibly could throughout my life to aspire to new and different things, although she had never seen those things before. We were extremely poor, and being raised in a single parent household with little to no income, on public assistance, living in a trailer with no running water. Those were real things for me. So I know what our kids confront, but because of that, I also know what our kids can achieve, because I'm not special by any means whatsoever. My kids, our students, can do anything they want. Absolutely. If they prepare their minds, and we put them in spaces where they can prepare themselves to be successful. So I want our kids to have that type of attitude, that it doesn't matter my circumstances, my current circumstances. I can overcome, I can achieve, and I can go any and everywhere I want to go. I just have to be willing to give up perhaps a little bit more than a student in the city next door to mine. It may look different. My journey may be very varied, but I can make it. And I want kids to understand that it is not about test scores.
Exactly. And, Dr. Brown, one thing I want to highlight, right? And that answer, I mean, there was just like 4 or 5, I like to say, not just meta themes, but mega themes that, our listeners can take back into their own individual practice. But there was one thing that you highlighted, right? Which is around, actually 2, but around standardized assessments, right? And a mutual friend of ours, Richard Carranza, would always say that assessments or we use screens, right, in the summer to keep bugs out of our house. But education use screens, i.e. benchmarks, benchmark assessments, formative assessments, standardized assessments to keep kids out, to keep kids from gaining that access and opportunity that you highlighted. And COVID played such a huge player within the change of education, right? And I think that now, being the first year in the AC stage of education, first typical year since 1819, I always say that we have this time to be permissionless. We have this time to be iterative. We have this time for experimentation, to be able to create a new model, because it shouldn't look the same for every kid. And you highlighted that. And, as somebody that did experience generational poverty, that did experience, coming from a single family house, absolutely, you can make it, right? But I think that now, you really highlight a subvariant that I'm really underscoring now within my corporation, is moving away from achievement to talking about ability of students. And when we talk about the ability of students, the acumen and the potential of students are highlighted, where now these screens are eliminated, where we can ensure that access and opportunity are for all. But absolutely, and having this space to be successful, creating that is, I think it's going to be an arduous task, because again, we're still fighting up against the political norms that we see. However, we still have to be that much more urgent with our practices to ensure we're creating those spaces. But you started to talk about your work in Montgomery, Alabama, Montgomery Public Schools. And Dr. Brown, I want to highlight one thing that I've been saying across the country, is that we should, 17,000 districts should be looking at their district improvement plans or their strategic operating plans, because it was probably completed before or even at the tail beginning of COVID. Now, as you highlighted in your last statement, was it can't be the same. It has to be different in your journey. It doesn't matter how you get to the end point, but your journey can't look the same. That is creating a flexible emergent model, right? We see that in our economic demand. I always use the two comparisons between Netflix and Blockbuster, right? Blockbuster went out of business because Netflix was the emergent that came in to take down the incumbent. But we see this now where the incumbent has been, I like to say, concretized, right, in education. And when you challenge it, the status quo, it pushes back even harder. But we're starting to see these changes, and you even said in 3 years you want to see this in Montgomery Public Schools, right? And a lot of people follow you, right? They want to see what your work. We know that you've been only 8 months in. Congratulations, Frat. This is a really, when I heard you got Alabama, I was really, really excited for you. But you started to highlight, and I like to use big abstractions, right? And the participant and you always break it down to this linear level, this granular level of simplifying it, right? But your change management process that you're doing right now to close opportunity and learning gaps in Montgomery is being emulated by a lot across the country. I know that because I see that. But I'm fond of your work because you and I share this mutual love around early literacy, right? You know, and I'm going to say this outlier because we can be as far as we can on Voices for Excellence, right? You don't see many African American men talking about the science of reading and foundational standards and really aligning routines and instructional practices within the MTSS model. That doesn't happen. But of course, you're going to have Dr. Brown and I going to underscore that real quick for you, because what I loved about Dr. Brown's previous capacity was his ability, or what we saw with the achievement levels, his ability to design a system to exponentially raise K2 literacy scores for Black and Brown students. Specifically, what was just astonishing was his the students that are transitioning from pre-K to K, kindergarten readiness scores was just ridiculous, right? Ridiculous. But tell me how you lead that in the AC stage of education. What does that look like now, Dr. Brown, when we talk about strategies to provide leaders to create true K2 literacy systems across the education sector in the AC stage of education?
I think as educators, early childhood educators, we have a pretty good understanding of how to convey concepts to kids so they can learn to read, and then of course read to learn. So those foundational pieces are in, but I think there's so much missing, and particularly in communities like mine here in Montgomery, we want to make sure kids have that type of opportunity from cradle to 4 years old. They have to be able to engage in literacy practices that some might think are non-traditional. Some families have been doing this for generations. I know I did it with my kids, something very, very simple. I read to my kids when they were still in the womb. Kids have to be able to hear words. They have to be able to understand the necessity of reading and why it's so important. And if we get them as early as possible, we hone this sense of reading and a love for reading that becomes something that changes their entire lives. So exposing them to print literature as early as possible, but working with our families who may or may not understand those concepts and giving them resources to tap into. It's one of the things we're looking at to do far more here in Montgomery, is to make sure our families are engaged in those types of conversations about what happens at home. You know, putting books in front of kids so they see them on a regular basis, making sure kids have books of their own that they can say they're theirs and they love, and they can actually see as part of how they develop as a person. Speaking of my own experience, I had no opportunities as a kid to go travel and see and do different things. So how did I go? I went through books and I went through movies. If I wanted to aspire to things, I saw it in a book, and I figured, read this, and that's something I may want to do. So by the time I became a high school student, and when I grew up, I still didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted to be somewhere between a cross of F. Scott Fitzgerald and James Bond. That's who I wanted to be. The only reason I was able to do that is through books and movies. So with books, you can go anywhere in the world and have any experiences you want through a book. Part of what, and I'm going to divert the conversation just a little bit and talking about literacy. The movement to restrict kids from being able to access certain types of literature. Those are the types of restrictive practices that don't lend themselves to giving kids a love of reading. Let kids read what they want to read. The
Mhm.
problem we've had in many respects in education is we want them to read these books that we have for them. Now, maybe our kids aren't interested in those books because those books aren't relatable for them. Their experience is very different, and they can't see themselves in what they're reading, then they're not going to be interested in it. So we have to be different about how that happens. Our kids have to be able to see themselves. But the early literacy component is crucial to how we close gaps, how we get kids to achieve, how we get kids to the level of expectation that we want them to have across the board, and having access for all kids to be successful. So I know how important it is. Far too often in school districts, we're in a position where we have to remediate or catch up students in upper middle school and high school, when if we had invested those resources on the other end of the continuum, when they're coming in the doors, we'd be in a far better place by the time they're freshmen, juniors, freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors. So that importance is crucial to me in understanding how we develop the science of reading in our classrooms, so our kids understand those processes, but also how we engage our parents in those venues as well.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Dr. Brown. And again, underscoring your statement, Generation Z and Generation Alpha, 50% Black and brown. We have to, as educators, this is our, I like to say, moral and education imperative, that we have books where students are represented, right? Where students see themselves, where we see gender inequities being dismantled strategically, where now we see a woman that's sitting at the head of the table, right? When we see now a Black and brown character being the hero. We need to start seeing that, because again, it draws engagement. You talked about that, right? Compliance, strategic compliance versus engagement. I can tell you this, Dr. Brown, from my experience in the K-12 sector and even in college, strategic compliance, so I can be able to get the grade and be able to get to where I am. I mean, that's where I was. It was only, I would say, probably roughly 5 to 15% of my total education, I was engaged. And when was I engaged? When I had teachers that looked like me, when I had a Black or a brown teacher, that can relate to the Black and brown struggles that we have. So, like I said, 5 to 15% out of this holistic educational experience, we can't emulate the same for our students right now. But I'm looking at my notes, and you talk about oral language development, phonological awareness within the MTSS model. I love that. But more importantly, you said conversations with parents, right? And when we talk about conversations with parents, there was a study, I can't remember, but I can't remember it, but the biggest difference, right, of this acquisition of standard English, quote unquote, right, is that there are more conversational discussions that are happening at home with affluent families, right, which ultimately introduces new vocabulary and context for families, right? But when we talk about parents that are living in poverty, is more directives with very limited rich vocabulary used in context. So when you talk about that cradle to four and really ensuring that parents are having deep discussions with their children, building that vocabulary and context. And I really like what you're doing in Montgomery with regards to that. But next question, I want to kind of underscore that question around the science of reading and this whole aspect of the MTSS model, but I want to go much more broadly. And for level setting purposes, I want to reference one of our oldies but goodies, Dr. Brown, Heifetz's work, right? Or Heifetz, I should say. I always mess his name up. Please forgive me, everybody, but this is regarding adaptive leadership. And a famous quote from that book, right? Leadership for change demands inspiration and perspiration. Woo! We know too much about that, Dr. Brown. Culture change is slow. It is slow. You're turning the ship midway right in the ocean, but adaptive leadership requires that persistency, right? That you and I always talk about. And it also requires an inordinate amount of perspiration, specifically that we have to do the heavy lift for all these heavy lift as executive leaders, right? But in your own words, Dr. Brown, how do you define this type of leadership as a Black or brown leader, knowing the outcome of this work, physical, mental, and it could be an outcome of forced resignation or termination?
Yeah, it's tricky. I know that, when we're doing this work, we came into these spaces for reasons. We wanted to benefit kids. At least that's why I know we came into this space. So knowing that there's sacrifices you have to make, there's certain times conversations you might have to make as well, that sometimes need to be nuanced, that have to be strategic. I try to live my work life is everything is strategic. And you purposely put yourself in places where you can have conversations about the things that need to be taking place, and you compel people to come to the table and join. No, you can't force them. You can only compel. And if you're in a space where you show them you're able to inspire them to understand the why of what we do, then you can have them put in the hard work for the perspiration part of it. And for me, it's always about, and you said this earlier about being a moral imperative. It's both a personal and a moral imperative for me to allow kids to learn to be productive citizens in our world and understand that this is not just about them. It's about others as well. Empathy is paramount in all the work I try to do. I want our kids to grasp that concept, to realize they have an opportunity to impact the world in a positive way. And if they're only looking through it through their own lens, they're never going to actually see the benefit of what their potential could be. So it's incredibly important, given what we have in our contemporary times, that we begin to see things through the eyes of others. We can think back to the violence we see in our communities. We can talk about the separation between, or the erasure, if you will, of the middle class, the separation between the haves and the have-nots. Our kids are going to have to fix that, because unfortunately, our generation as a whole was very self-driven. We were always looking for ways to get ahead ourselves. Accomplishing and arriving is when you can get ahead and bring others with you. And I want our kids to truly understand that, and realizing that, in our communities, our similarities are far greater than our differences. And it doesn't matter what differences we have. If we can pull everyone up, everyone benefits. I think about something as simple as let's use racism as an example. This is a quick example. Obviously, from a moral standpoint, racism is terrible. But let's think about it just from in economic terms. Economically, it doesn't make any sense, because it causes you to lose money. It causes you to lose capacity. You lose talent, you lose opportunities. So it doesn't make any sense, but yet we have so much of it that's pervasive throughout our communities that we're having to fight this battle. I want our kids to understand they have an opportunity to change them. They have an opportunity to say everybody is welcome at the table. Everybody can be a part of the solution. And through school, through education, through self-improvement, through community improvement, we can make all of that go away. We can work together to make that happen. So, inspiring people to understand that that's important, and then putting in the sweat equity to make that happen on a regular basis. That's the bottom line about the work. And honestly, for me, that's why I do what I do. It's exhausting.
Yes.
It's frustrating.
Yes.
It's sometimes disappointing. And then you have a light that pops and something happens and you're like, okay, that's why I do this. And you start the cycle all over again. I was able to watch our students at BTW High School for the Performing Arts Friday night perform their showcase. Amazing talent. That if we had not reached those kids in certain ways, we may not ever have been able to tap into that talent, and they wouldn't be able to display their talent for the world. So giving kids those opportunities to be successful in the ways that they want to be successful was so important in this process. I've always said I want kids to have a really hard decision to make when they leave high school. If every kid has to make this hard decision upon graduation, we've done our job. They can choose to go to school, they can choose to go to work, they can choose to go in the military, or they can choose to start a business. If every kid has to make a choice from all four of those, that means we've done our job. Unfortunately, in the way we've been designed, many of our kids don't have all those choices. They have to make a forced choice that may not be what they truly want to do.
Yeah. And when you think about that empathy and sweat equity, right, and choices, that underpins specifically a transformation, a reimagination of education in totality, right? Because when you lead with empathy, that means you are leading with the student voice and the constituent voice in mind, right? And it's weird, right? It's not weird, but it is weird because when we talk about empathy, it's the first element of design thinking, right? Any type of entrepreneur or any type of progressive business leader, or even a very, very, forward thinking organization always underpin design thinking, because you're not designing for the bureaucrats, you're designing for your population, your most important customer, which is your students and your families. But we don't see that enough, right? We don't see that grounded approach where our students want representation in the curriculum, but we develop policies that is the antithesis of that.
Yes.
So we have to really now move towards that empathy model where it's going to be a lot of sweat equity for our leaders and for us. But I want to get down to, I really want to, I want to expand on this, right? Because I think it's really critically important, specifically when we talk about organizational effectiveness and organizational efficacy. We have to eliminate racism, right? You said it. Economically, it hurts us. We lose money, we lose talent. Let's even look at this from the context of, systemic racism within our systems, right? In order for us to reach organizational effectiveness and organizational efficacy. Dr. Brown, I know that this is going to be a hard question, but I really want you to really focus in on this, because I think our viewers need to understand how to create or how to move towards or eliminating racism in a system, or a system that's obsolete of racism, where now, just like where we see how economically racism can hold us down, right? From the standpoint of money, people, talent. Let's think about this in the context of systemic racism in the traditional education model, where it's holding down not only access and opportunity, but in totality, organizational effectiveness and efficacy. How do we move towards that, grounding innovation, excellence, and equity for our students?
I think, for one, we have to redesign our curriculum so that it is inclusive, and making sure kids can see themselves, no matter their backgrounds. They can see themselves in what they're learning and things they're participating in. But I think in terms of what it looks like in the classroom, we need kids to be able to work together, to learn things from each other, and we don't keep divergent opinions apart. Unfortunately, in our current society, if you and I agree on something, then we're on the same team. But you disagree with me, now all of a sudden we don't like each other, and I got to go over to this other team. I think that's the most insane thing we could possibly have done, when we don't have divergent opinions that have an opportunity to actually talk and find out why those differences occur. Finding out where is common ground, because among all of us, there's common ground, no matter what our ideology might be. If we understand each other better, if we know each other better, we're going to want to treat each other better. That's just human nature. We're talking about, something as simple as community policing that we do in communities. When that happens, and our police force knows our community, they tend to work better together. It's just, that's the way that has to happen. So our kids have to have those opportunities in classrooms. They also have to understand to accept difference. While those differences are there, and I still believe our similarities are greater, but we have to acknowledge those differences and say, it's okay that you're different. It's okay that your experience is different. I remember as a kid, growing up the way I did, and being as poor as I was and having to go to school, it was a stigma where I felt I had to hide that. And you suffer from imposter syndrome, where you have to go into spaces and be somebody that you're really not, because those pieces aren't going to be accepted. We got to teach that out of our kids. We learn that behavior. They're not innately born with that behavior. So when different kids come to the table and work together to solve problems, you're going to find out, oh, this kid's different from me, but you know what? She's brilliant at this. He helped our team do this. And when we're solving problems together that impact the world, our kids are going to be greater for it. It's a really hard question to answer, because then you have to look at the adults, in that we as adults have not been taught in that way. And so shaking off those past experiences and that past way of learning is difficult for many adults. I'd like to, I'm old, I call myself old, but I'm hoping that I have a young heart. and that I'm willing to change, and I'm willing to understand that I don't have to like or agree with everything. That's not why we live. The idea is we can agree to disagree, and we can disagree without being disagreeable. That's very easy to do. So no matter what we might disagree on, guaranteed there are going to be things we have in common. And if those are going to be the things that make us better, and we solve problems through those pieces, then that's where we should land. Unfortunately, you know, our media, our money's made on divisiveness, unfortunately, and it's very disconcerting. And I'm hoping that our next generation of students are going to be able to change that for us.
Absolutely. And Dr. Brown, and one thing I just want to highlight, right, is that this whole context of imposter syndrome. And I think that the way that the current education model is designed from a structural and system standpoint, I think that a lot of our students of color have to adopt and adapt, I should say, adopt a new a new aura to them when they go in the classroom, which they shouldn't lose their identity, right? And when I think about imposter syndrome, I think of code switching, right? I think of when we think about, you know, when I was in school, you know, naturally, when I'm around you, Dr. Brown, we're in person, we're two different people, right? Because I can tell you this, everybody, when Dr. Brown and I, when we're together, we're not talking like this. So now you're actually seeing us code switch to the mainstream, and for us to be able to deliver this, because I mean, obviously we are who we are, of course. But again, it's this, why do kids or students have to lose their identity to order to be accepted in the mainstream? And I was just or last month, I was in California for the CALSA Mid-Advance Conference, and I attended a session, and it was around, you know, and women, lifting women voices and in education. And right now, I learned this stark data from the CALSA Mid-Advance Conference is that only 4% of superintendents are Black and brown women of color, right? And they have to, in order for them to get the job, they have to develop an imposter syndrome. And it was just a compelling conversation because you know, I was one of the only two men that were in the room, but I wanted to be able to advance my equity stance and my equity delivery in the context for gender equity, for more advocating for more women superintendent. Within the past month, a mutual friend of ours, Dr. Barbara Mullen, a sister of mine, I call her my sister, just got, you know, Rush Henrietta in New York. Very proud of that, but we need more of that, you know. And we need to move away from this imposter syndrome, because that's where I think the systemic racism exists within the system. Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Brown. I know you want to say something.
That's the beauty of being in these roles, because we truly have that opportunity. The question is, do we seize it? I've tried throughout my career is to lift women's voices, because I want them to be in the party just like I am. And honestly, in many respects, they're much smarter than I am. I think about my chief of staff here in Montgomery. She was my HR director when I was in Ohio. She came down here with me to Montgomery as a chief of staff. And my goal for her is to be a superintendent in 3 years. It would be very easy for me to say, you know, Jamie, I want you to continue to stay with me forever because she does her job so well. But that's selfish on my part. It's my job to help open doors for her. Some folks open some doors for me. It's my responsibility to give back and do it for others. And I think we all should have that notion in mind when we're talking about cultivating talent in this space. We know there's a shortage of superintendents and great educators throughout our country. How do we cultivate the new ones to come through and do the work? Because someone's going to have to do it for our next generation of kids. I know she's going to be ready to do that. And I'm really, really proud of that effort. There are other people within our organizations that have been in organizations over the years, and I want to see them thrive and do well. And, you know, selfishly, the better they do, the better I do. And I think if we're able to look at it from that standpoint, that you're not only benefiting them, you're also benefiting yourself and the organization, it's much easier to move that needle. I'm happy to assist someone who truly wants to go into this role, who then understands what this role entails, because not everybody can do it. There are days I don't think I can do it, but it's challenging, and we have to accept that, but we also have to make sure we prepare others to step into those roles.
Absolutely. It's one, I tell you, you know, being a superintendent, and you know this, Dr. Brown, it is one of the most challenging, taxing jobs ever. I mean, I can infer, because I remember my 13, 14-hour nights and then waking up in the morning and worried about, am I going to have to call school because of snow? Those are, the balance of those things. But when you talk about, I'm going to reference a coach that's in your great state right now, Nick Saban, right? You want to be the Nick Saban, your offensive coordinator. He's not supposed to be there more than a year or two because you want him to become a head coach. Same thing with Bill Belichick, right? You want to be able to develop your assistants where, you want them to go on, because now where we look at leadership is if your assistant soup or somebody's there, obviously if they don't want to move forward, with that, but, into the executive role, but, if they're there for 4, 5, 6 years, I'm looking at them like, well, okay, how come they're not moving? I like to see that cycle. That means, hey, I got a deep bench that I was developing for the executive role, because we do need more leaders out there. I think I just heard it was a glaring stat. It was last month. Dr. Alex Marrero, he told me that there were 29 superintendent openings in Massachusetts. 29. Wow. But last question, Dr. Brown. I know you got a lot of time. We could talk forever, but I'm only going to limit you to 3 words. Now, for an alpha man, that's very, 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 very hard. But I'm going to tell you this, everybody breaks the rule, right? We got, 3 plus, 2 or 3 sentences here. Then you got, 3 times 300. Then you got people that have just been, okay, I'm just going to give you a full 10-minute answer when I was only supposed to take 3 words. So I don't expect you to follow the rules on this, but I'm just going to limit it. I'm going to say, hey, it's 3 words and that's it. But what 3 words, right, Dr. Brown, do you want today's audience to leave with regarding urgency and leadership, right? And I want to add a word in there: urgency, leadership, and change. How do you want our listeners or our participants today, right, to start leading the coalition of change, where we are evaluating, implementing, and executing for a system of all?
Wow, 3 words, that is tough. 3 words, but I'll probably have to give them some context. The 3 words I would say would be survival of humanity.
Woo.
If we don't move differently in educational spaces and get our kids prepared for a world that's very different from the one that we walked into as 18-year-olds when long time ago ourselves, the survival of our humanity is at stake. Violence, disrespect, lack of empathy, all those things are signs of, in my opinion, are signs, and I'm no clinician or by any stretch, but to me, those are signs of the denigration of humanity. And if we don't take care of humanity and demonstrate respect and empathy for humanity, our whole society falls apart. And we end up being some type of sci-fi movie, which I don't want to live in that space. I don't want my granddaughter to feel in those, be in those types of spaces. And I think we have a responsibility to the world to make it better in that regard. So the moral imperative is education needs to happen for the survival of humanity.
Absolutely. And Dr. Brown, I want to personally thank you for being on Voices for Excellence, the Black Excellence series. Will you be at AASA?
Absolutely will.
All right, so you'll be at AASA, and this will be aired. I will be at TAPSY. So I have a keynote panel at TAPSY. But if anybody that is going to be attending AASA this year in San Antonio, please go seek out Dr. Brown and ask your specific questions, to Dr. Brown, because the rationale I say that is that he is approachable, right? You just walk up to him. You might not even know him, but if you have a question for him, he is not going to turn his back. He is not going to turn away from you. He is going to address it specifically and come with the hard questions, right? Because, he is one of the talents, right, that I look to and still reach out to specifically regarding questions, approaches, methodology, typology of different practices to be able to change the world for kids. So Dr. Melvin Brown, my fraternity brother that I love. Good to see you, brother. Glad to have you on Voices for Excellence.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. And to our participants today, again, happy Black History Month. Keep on celebrating and onward and upward. Take care, everybody.